A lot of Middle Eastern history is missing from traditional curricula in many parts of the world. So if the stories we tell become the world we inhabit, if discourse kind of reifies the world, then people without stories are people without a world, or sometimes even without a sense of humanity. And it makes it easier, I think, to dehumanize people whose history has been erased, omitted, or reassigned to others. So maybe in a way it's like an antidote to Orientalism.
Is there any record of them ever thinking to themselves, man, it is amazing that we live in the cradle of civilization?
That's
What a cradle to be born in. We could have been born in any cradle. We picked the cradle of civilization. What a great cradle. Welcome to the Afikra podcast. My name is Mikey Mhenna. Today on this series, we have Dr. Moudhy Al-Rashid, who is the author of Between Two Rivers, Ancient Mesopotamia and the Birth of History. Moudhy is also a honorary fellow at Wolfson College, which is part of the University of Oxford. Moudhy, welcome to the series.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Okay, here's a real quick question. Your book is about Mesopotamia, Between Two Rivers. Where is Mesopotamia? What is Mesopotamia? When is Mesopotamia? What is this place that I've heard of my entire life, but may or may never have been to?
Yeah, so Mesopotamia is the name of the region between and around the two rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates, which run through what is now Iraq and Syria and parts of Turkey as well. And the two rivers and the surrounding environment you sometimes may have heard of it referred to as the Fertile Crescent, or, sometimes also the cradle of civilization. But it had really fertile soil that, together with various innovations in agriculture, like irrigation methods, led to such incredible farming around 3000 BCE that inspired other developments, like the development of writing and the birth of the first cities. So the name Mesopotamia comes from the Greek between the rivers. In Arabic, we know it's Bilad Bain al-Nahrain or Ma Bain al-Nahrain. So all of the kind of names for this region are centered on these two life-giving rivers. And it was a place that was home to many cultures and civilizations in antiquity. So for the when, we're talking about around 3300 BCE until around, I guess, 0 BCE or 100 CE. That's the kind of period that is often covered by this area of study. So the Sumerians were in the early periods, around 3000 BCE for about 1,000 years, and then later the Assyrians and Babylonians, who may be more familiar to people in the region, and even later than that, the Persians from about 500 BCE. And all of these civilizations kind of gave us some of the world's firsts, like the first writing, the first written sciences, the earliest literature, the earliest written histories, war memorials, and much more. And a common denominator that they all shared, in addition to the region where they lived, was the writing system of Cuneiform, which is shared by all the civilizations that rose and fell and gave us all these some of these incredible firsts.
Okay, before we get to cuneiforms, when did the word Mesopotamia actually become used as a way to describe this place? Did people think of themselves as Mesopotamians? Obviously in a different language, but was that a term that people used?
That's a great question. It's more of a modern invention, or early modern, really. I think it's because it comes from the Greek. I think it maybe was used in ancient Greek sources, but I'm not really familiar with those. But it really gets kind of cemented in people who are doing the ancient history of this region. So it's a Western term for sure. It's not. But I know a lot of people from the region who are happy to use it, and it is the one that's kind of the most familiar, which is one of the reasons I'm sticking with it for now.
Yeah. Again, before we get to cuneiforms, I'm really excited to talk to you because I've always been curious about this idea of the cradle of civilization. Did the humans who actually live at that time, is there any record of them ever thinking to themselves, man, it is amazing that we live in the cradle of civilization?
That's
what a cradle to be born in. We could have been born in any cradle. We picked the cradle of civilization. What a great cradle.
That is such a great question. I think probably they might not have seen it that way, because I think life would have been, whether they had great agriculture and all these amazing firsts that we consider milestones in human history that, made further milestones possible. I think life was probably still pretty difficult. If you imagine life without all the conveniences that we're used to and the technology, without basic medical care like antibiotics, without a social structure that can scoop up those who aren't lucky enough to have a kind of birth lottery, economic birth lottery of some kind. If all those things are missing, then life is quite difficult. You're kind of on your own in a lot of ways. I mean, you have your community, of course, but in terms of, if your kid has a fever and, the doctor can't do anything, I can't even imagine how hard that would have been.
Yeah.
But, it's looking back, it's certainly the sources are incredible for what they can tell us, whether it's good or bad or something else. It's just a huge amount of information, which is incredible to have.
The innovations that were developed during this obviously like multi-millennia period, are those innovations that were things that affected the daily life of everyone, or was it really affecting, to use a 21st century word, like affecting the 1% exclusively? Were people getting to reap the benefits of language being invented, or alphabets and sort of writing technology being invented, agricultural techniques really being invented? Was that something that people actually enjoyed?
Maybe. I think that's another great question. I think if we think about the circumstances that gave rise to some of these firsts, I think that in some ways those circumstances might have made life a little bit either easier or allowed for a little bit more diversity. So if we rewind a little bit to the birth of writing, it's if I can be like forgiven for giving a really broad picture, if we have really successful agriculture, which is due to the fertile soil, but also the various innovations in agriculture that allowed people to tame the weather in a way, or to accommodate the fluctuating weather, and that leads to a surplus of food. That's a good thing, right? And that gets redistributed through a temple. And what that basically means is that people not everyone has to be part of food production, because there is so much food. It frees people up to do other stuff. So in a sense, maybe that's good, because then people can go into various crafts, or can specialize in whatever sorts of medical culture was available in the early periods, for which we don't have any sources directly for that. So possibly good, but then again, also bad, because you start to see the beginnings of social stratification in which a 1% does emerge. So maybe good and bad in a way. I think writing wasn't available to everyone. Some of these biggest milestones, like the birth of writing, wasn't available to everyone. So it itself may not have affected everyone's day-to-day life. But I think it's a really interesting question that forces us to think about what we value in the historical sources versus what the people at the time might have valued from those developments. Okay.
If somebody's listening to this podcast and has listened to many episodes over the last 5 years, the word cuneiform has come up before. What is a cuneiform? What is this multisyllabic word that it only gets discussed in these sort of settings? What does cuneiform mean?
So cuneiform or cuneiform, both pronunciations are used, is a writing system from ancient Mesopotamia that was at first traced into clay, but eventually impressed. So if you imagine you have a clay tablet and you're pushing a reed stylus into it, it creates these triangles, these tiny triangles, which is where cuneus from cuneiform comes from. In Latin, it's wedge. So only Latin I know is cuneus, so please don't ask me any more questions about Latin, not that you were going to. But so cuneiform is a writing system, and in the same sense that, the letters that we use to write Arabic can also be used to write other languages. You can even write English with Arabic letters if you want to. Mm-hmm. And same with the alphabet used to write English is also used to write French and German with some variations. So cuneiform was a writing system, and it was used to write different languages. The first language it was used to write, the earliest one, is Sumerian, which is not related to any known language. And then the writing system gets expanded and developed by scribes in really, really interesting ways, where they kind of use existing meanings and sounds of signs to assign more, basically, to each sign, so that it can be used to write other languages, and primarily in this region, Akkadian, which is a Semitic language, completely unrelated again to Sumerian. And yet the writing system becomes flexible enough to accommodate two totally different languages, and eventually about 10 languages, all told.
How did this actually get decoded? How did we figure out a way to read this? Was there like a what is this app that I'm trying to remember?
Duolingo, maybe?
No, not Duolingo.
Okay.
The other one with the 3 languages.
I don't know.
The famous tablet that they've discovered that helped
the Rosetta Stone.
The Rosetta Stone.
Yeah, gotcha. Okay.
Is there a Rosetta Stone moment with cuneiform?
That's another great question, because there isn't, but we've sort of tried to make one because it makes it easier to write about what is actually a really like long-term, piecemeal, disjointed effort at decipherment. There wasn't like a philological race between, who was it, Thomas Young in England and then Champollion, I forget his first name, in France for the Rosetta Stone. There wasn't anything really like that. There was some rivalry because there's always intellectual rivalry, as there is today. But but there were 2 key sites of study that gave modern scholars many Rosetta Stones. The ruins of Persepolis, which was the capital of the Persian or Achaemenid Empire. And there are like trilingual inscriptions all in cuneiform, but it's 3 different languages. And then there's a rock-carved relief at Behistun in Iran, which is sometimes called the Rosetta Stone of cuneiform. But by the time Behistun was discovered, there was already quite a lot of work that had been done on decipherment. And again, there we have an inscription written in triplicate in 3 parts. So there's an Old Persian section in cuneiform, an Elamite section in cuneiform, and an Akkadian, which was called at the time Babylonian section. And it's an account of Darius the Great fighting 19 battles, crushing rebellions, that sort of thing. And someone called Henry Rawlinson, who was, I think he was a British East India officer, he supposedly scaled the rocks to make drawings, but I think actually he sent children to do it for him because it was quite difficult to do. And he ends up translating the Old Persian text and publishing it in the 1840s. But way before that, a German philologist called, I'm going to pronounce his name incorrectly in German, but it's written George Grotefund. He partially had already translated the Behistun text. And then there's a third person, there are a couple of others, but there's a third major player whose name is Edward Hincks, who is an Irish clergyman. And I think his contribution actually outshines everyone else's, because what he did was he matched up the characters on these large monumental rock faces from Persepolis and Behistun to the clay tablets that were found. And he called the font used in the clay tablets cursive, and the font used in these kind of monumental ones lapidary. And he was able to match them up, which basically unlocked thousands and thousands and thousands more texts to use as keys for decipherment. So I think, again, it's like a really disjointed, not a very exciting story, but ultimately those steps brought people to the point where they were able to read those clay tablets, which is a kind of game changer.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to ask you a question that could sound cheeky, and I don't mean for it to sound cheeky, but I want to know what smart people in your line of work, how they would answer this. Okay? What is the point of studying this stuff?
Yeah.
What is the point of studying it as a profession, as a field? Obviously, there is one, but what is the point of it? And what do we stand to learn, essentially? And what is at stake for us in the region, in what some might describe as the Arab world? What is at stake for us if we are going to study Mesopotamia and try to understand this place?
Yeah, I think it's another great question. I don't know how others would answer it, but I can tell you why I think it's important. I mean, I think studying history is important, not just because, what do people say? If you don't learn history, then you're doomed to repeat it. Not that it seems to matter, because people seem to be repeating history before our eyes in the worst possible ways. But I think history contains lessons that you can't learn in a single lifetime, right? There's like huge swaths, I don't know how to say that word, of lessons that you can't necessarily get even in a single generation of lessons. And I think that's in the cuneiform texts as well. Some of the literary works tell us a little bit about how wisdom comes from an accumulation of knowledge over time. And the science texts tell us that wisdom and knowledge and science comes from an accumulation of work over time. So I think there's that angle. But I think a lot of Middle Eastern history is missing from traditional curricula in many parts of the world. And I think that's made it easier to dismiss certain groups of people from the Middle East as ahistorical and maybe even irrational or irrational. So if the stories we tell become the world we inhabit, if discourse kind of reifies the world, then people without stories are people without a world, or sometimes even without a sense of humanity. And it makes it easier, I think, to dehumanize people whose history has been erased, omitted, or reassigned to others. So maybe in a way it's like an antidote to Orientalism. I don't know. I haven't really talked about it in this way, and I don't really make this argument in my book in any way, but the book is just that history itself. And maybe ultimately that was one of my goals is to kind of fill that gap and show us that the people in the past were human, and the people in the region today who connect with the people from the past are also we're people, just like, I mean, we're all care about the same things really, ultimately.
Yeah. You tell this story in the intro of the book about this course you took, the Book in the Ancient World. I'm curious if you can tell a little bit of that story and some of those objects that humanize this history for you, that you were just like, oh, obviously these people were humans.
Yeah. So I was in my 20s, and like any cool person in my 20s, I decided to take a summer class on the Book in the Ancient World. And that was in London, and the first day was on clay tablets from ancient Mesopotamia. And it was taught by a curator at the British Museum called Dr. Irving Finkel. And I realized the irony of this coming right after what I just said about an antidote to Orientalism. This is like my introduction to this came from the British Museum. But the kind of tablets that he put on the radar really were just incredible to me. There was one that was a map of ancient Babylonia and Assyria, and I actually feel like I have a kind of fake copy of it somewhere, but it's a circle. I'm gonna grab it even if I'm like uncentered for a second. This is someone in Turkey who sent this to me, who made this, and this is these are like mythical areas, and then this is a kind of borderland, and then here's the Tigris and Euphrates, I think, or maybe that's the Tigris and Euphrates. I can't remember exactly what's what, and I'm not going to sit here and try to read it because that'll take too long. But and I just thought, oh my goodness, people are making maps, but they're also making maps with mythical places on them, so they have an understanding of their world and the place in it already. In 2,500 years ago, which is roughly when this not this object, it's a fake, but when the original was made, and I just thought that was so incredible. And there were so many other cuneiform tablets that drew me in. There's a map of the stars on the night of January 30th in 650, I think, BCE. That's on display. And I just thought, oh my goodness, they were making star maps as well, writing letters to each other, writing literature. I just thought the whole thing was so incredible. And I was supposed to be going to law school. Well, I was supposed to take the LSAT again because I did so badly on the LSAT the first time I took it to go to law school. And I thought, never mind that. I'm going to go into this. This is really lighting my fire in a totally different and unexpected way.
The world does need more lawyers. So I'm happy that you went that way. Okay. I want to talk a little bit about your approach to writing the book. So many years later, you decide to write this book, but the book is sort of centers around objects. So maybe let's take a second to explore and explain the sort of structure of the book and why you structured it that way.
Yeah, so Between Two Rivers, the book tells the history of Mesopotamia through objects found in what was believed to be, and in some ways may still be, an ancient museum in the city of Ur that was in the palace of a princess called Enigaldinana. And she was the daughter of the last independent Babylonian king Nabonidus in the 500s BCE. And there, a whole bunch of objects were found from really early periods in what was essentially the wrong archaeological layer. So if you think of an archaeological dig as like a layer cake, like a rainbow layer cake, where at the bottom is the really old stuff that's the most squished, and then you get the earlier stuff at the top. There was stuff that should have been at these bottom layers in the top layer of the cake. So for example, so again, we're talking about the 500s BCE. There was an ornate title deed that's shaped like a tombstone that was basically like a boundary stone that was from the 1100s BCE. There's a clay cone inscribed by a ruler called Kudur Mabuk that's from the 1800s BCE. There's a statue fragment of a king from around 2000 BCE. So all these much older things are found in the palace of this princess. And excavators at the time in the 1920s also found in that, they say it's in the same room as all these objects were found, but I go into that in the book because I think there are some problems with that picture. A small cylindrical clay tablet. So most clay tablets are shaped like, like a tablet, like an iPhone, like this thing. And this was shaped like a cylinder, and it contained a description of another object that they didn't find, which was a brick from around 2000 BCE, and the circumstances of its discovery by the governor of Ur at the time, whose name was Sin Balasu Iqbi. And it says in that document that the brick was there for viewing or for display. The word in Akkadian is tamartu. So that made excavators think, oh, actually, maybe this is a little collection of antiquities or a museum where things were displayed. And that is the oldest known exhibition label. So I used this museum as a way into a thematic history of the region. I thought to give a chronological history from start to finish would have just been impossible. It would have been too overwhelming, and I didn't want to lose readers in, trying to give too much detail when there are actually so many incredibly interesting things that one can spotlight while still getting enough of a picture to know a bit about ancient Mesopotamian history. So that was the approach that I took. I took it through, each object offers us a way into some theme in Mesopotamian history rather than trying to cover everything.
Yeah. I want to talk about Ur as a city for a second. Yeah. Why does a city like that was so important to so many people at one point, and economies of which so many people were a part, kind of die?
Climate. Is
that right?
Yeah. So the Euphrates River, which is where Ur was situated, and I think it's around 300 BCE. I'm surprisingly bad at remembering dates, despite being a historian. It changes where it flows. And so the city, having been on the edge of that river, basically the area dries out, it becomes too desertified to function, and the site has to be abandoned. So yeah, climate change in a way, even if it's accidental.
Simple and like devastating.
Yeah, it really is.
Okay, I want to take a break in this to play a little bit of a game, which I told you about. I wanted to before. So let's do this exercise since we're talking about objects, kind of like a silly like GQ what's in your bag game. What are the 5 objects that you wish you could actually have? Your favorite 5 objects that you came across that you're like, these objects from Mesopotamia are, I wish I could have on my mantle or in my bag.
Yeah, so in my book, I talk about quite a sad story about these twins, these toddlers from a city called Imar in what is now Syria. And there's a really dry legal text that tells us that their family fell on hard times, and I think they called it a year of distress. And so the parents are forced to sell a baby and 4 toddlers, I think it's 4 toddlers, into slavery. Not for the parents to benefit from the price, but for the children to be able to continue to be fed by someone and looked after. And part of the record for this includes footprints of the toddlers. And I just find the fact that we have the footprints of these really small people who must have been so confused and terrified in this moment of their life where they're being removed from their family, this moment of goodbye that I just can't get out of my head. So I don't know that I necessarily want that in my bag, but I want that to be remembered, you know? So it's I think it's one of my favorite things that I write about in the book, because it shows this moment in a life that would have otherwise been forgotten, but it also shows us what we can learn about people from ancient Mesopotamia, what they went through. And similarly, there's a kind of text trail. So again, we're talking about cuneiform clay tablets for a woman called La Tubashini in the 500s BCE. And she entered her life as a slave through marriage, as an enslaved person through marriage, and had 6 children, at least, that we know of, who then took on her same legal status. And there's a record from 580 BCE where she's freed, and the first thing she does once she's freed is to fight for the freedom of her children. So I find that also an incredibly moving story, where she takes on a really powerful family as someone who's been totally disenfranchised and has spent her life doing stuff that is not, that she wasn't free to choose or not choose, fighting for her children. Similarly, there's a letter, not similarly, but another mother that I really find the text kind of moving, that preserves the story. There's a woman called Lamasi from Assyria, and she's writing to her husband around 1800 BCE, where she's making textiles for him to sell in Anatolia, which is now Turkey. And she's basically writing to him saying, I'm tired. Like, I'm raising all these kids by myself. Like, I'm making their clothes. I'm making these textiles. I'm making the food. And if you think about, being a working parent today and but also on top of that, you can't just buy packaged bread and microwave meals or whatever. You have to do everything from scratch or go to whatever shop and buy clothes, on top of also working. And I just can't imagine. And I think she had 7 children. I can't even imagine having to do that. And then if we kind of take a step back to broader objects, I think another one that I would really love, I really love, period, whether it's in my bag or not, is the law collection of Hammurabi or Hammurapi. And I love that because it's the first written collection of laws, but we really don't 100% know what it was for. And it was humongous. It's like 6 feet tall. And It's these laws, over 100 laws carved into this extremely difficult to carve stone in a beautiful font, in a beautiful ancient, archaic font on purpose, trying to look older on purpose, telling us a little bit about maybe some legal norms, but we don't think that they were necessarily applied to the letter. And it was also a little bit about scholarship and how people compose documents like this. I just think that's such a special document.
Can I ask you a question about that one?
Yeah, sure. Mm-hmm.
Like, was there even a legal structure? Were there courts and were there,
Yeah, there were. So there were judges, there were witnesses are described, using a word for the elders, kind of. Mm-hmm. People could, if they had a dispute with someone, let's say over a non-payment of something or other, they could go, in certain periods, they could go to a court, they could go to judges, they could go to ministers, but they could also even go to the king, like a majlis today, where you go and you air your concern, and either the king adjudicates it or he assigns somebody to figure out what to do. So there was a very well-established legal culture. The question with the Hammurabi's laws is, how does that fit into it, if at all? Because I think scholars used to think of it as like legislation, as equivalent to legislation, but there's actually not a single legal document. And there are lots of everyday legal documents, whether we're talking about contracts or lawsuits or other types of everyday legal documents that cite any of these laws in any way. So it's possible there just wasn't a practice of citing laws. That's one option. But it's also possible that these laws were composed for some other reason that was more scholarly and ideological, to show that the king was a just king and that he was making sure that justice was prevailing in the land. And there are elements of the law collection itself that suggest it was more of an ideological, scholarly document. So it's really interesting.
Super interesting. Okay, what else is on the list?
Oh gosh. There is, I don't know where, I think it's from the city of Nippur, but there is a really messy, broken tablet from a school that is just a single wedge impressed over and over and over again. And this would have been done by a kid, maybe an 8-year-old, who is going to school on their first day and practicing how to do a cuneiform sign. And I just think that that's the coolest thing ever. It's a
Wow.
record of a child, but it's also a mess. Like, it's so adorable. Yeah, people had to learn it back then too, to use it.
Yeah. Is there anything else in the bag, or should I keep going, you think?
I feel like that's 5 things, but if we keep going, then we could be here for 6 to 10 hours, and that's
Okay.
probably not in your.
There's one that I want to talk about, which is this idea of the broken heart, which you and I spoke to you about briefly, and it being related to it actually being a medical concept.
Yeah.
So can you explain that idea, the broken heart as a medical concept in Mesopotamia?
Yeah, so the expression in Akkadian is chip libi, and it comes from 2 words. Chip comes from chepu, which means to break, and libi comes from libu. It's the genitive. Not that I'm not going to bore you with grammar, but just so that there's some idea of why
It's a
it
flex.
changes. Yeah.
I'm not going to bore
really
you
dark.
with Akkadian grammar. I could be here all day.
Yeah, I literally could, though. That's the sad bit because I love it so much. Libu is heart, but it also has a wider semantic range. It can mean inside, it can mean stomach, it can mean mind or thoughts. So it's like an emotive as well as a physical thing, a physical organ. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, he feels Enkidu's, his lover and friend who's died. He feels his chest to see if his heart is beating. So there is also a sense of it as just like a heart, the circulation organ. And the pairing of break and heart in this way appears in many sources. It appears in letters from medical professionals to the king complaining about, not being in the inner circle of the king anymore. What did I do wrong? My heart is broken. Please, please fix it by taking me back in. It appears in a really old account of the flood called the Epic of Atrahasis, that is from the 17th century BCE. And Atrahasis is like this Noah figure who is meant to build a boat to put all the seed of mankind and animals and the craftspeople on to survive the flood that he's warned about by one of the gods. And he gets everyone in his village to help him build this boat. And on the eve of the storm that only he knows is coming, he throws a feast. But he can't sit there. He can't sit still. He's pacing back and forth. And there's a description of his heart being broken, and he's vomiting because he just feels so sick and sad about what's about to happen, possibly. But it also appears in medical texts as a kind of technical term. And these medical texts are very dry, but they include descriptions of chip libi, so heartbreak, among symptoms that capture mental distress and other forms of suffering that may or may not be related to mental distress. So, for example, there's a therapy text, so a text that describes a clay tablet that describes a bunch of symptoms and then what is the treatment for all these symptoms. From the 7th century BCE, from the library of a medical professional called Kitsir Ashur. And in this text, heartbreak is grouped with fear, grief, foolish thoughts, and the underlying cause is thought to be divine anger, but it gives like a really specific treatment for it. And there's another one that groups heartbreak with fear, just like really kind of fear that is so intense that it requires medical intervention. So I think heartbreak is a kind of anxiety, but it's not just the emotional anxiety. I mean, when we feel anxious, we have a host of other things going on. Like we start sweating, we get a stomach ache, our chest feels like someone's sitting on it. There's a lot of ways to understand anxiety physically as well as emotionally. And in Akkadian medical texts, there isn't this kind of like dualism between mind and body that you get in, well, not so much anymore, but that you used to get in modern biomedicine. It's more, everything's sort of like overlaid on everything else. So I think Chip Libi is telling us a lot about how people experience fear, worry, anxiety that is so pathological it requires and is validated by kind of a medical encounter to treat it. So I think heartbreak is both an emotional and a physical thing, not necessarily to do with love, but just to do with like a response to stress in life more generally.
Yeah, it's interesting because like I'm hearing you talk about this, and I always have the assumption that knowledge is cumulative, and that it's like this monotonically increasing mathematical function, and it never goes down. knowledge is a function of time and it only increases over time. Maybe it plateaus, but it only increases over time. Because how could we unknow things as a civilization? But it seems like hearing you talk about things and just the layer cake of knowledge and how some things just get buried and get lost. When you study this length of time period that is at least 2,000 years away, do you feel the sense of how much knowledge actually like gets lost and how knowledge ebbs and flows, like cumulative knowledge?
So I definitely get a sense that a lot of things that people think are modern or woke or whatever are actually really ancient. So in that sense, maybe there are things missing from people's radar or otherwise that have been lost and buried that only certain few people have access to for whatever reason. And I do get this feeling that we've lived a lot of this stuff before, right? Like, to take the example I just gave, like problems with medical problems related to mood and the various physiological kind of related symptoms. Those are not new. Like millennials did not invent depression and anxiety. Like we're not, there's also gender fluidity in the ancient world. That's not a modern invention. So I think like in that sense, maybe they're deliberately buried or maybe there's just an access issue. But it feels like these modern things are not so modern. They've kind of been around for as long as we've been writing stuff down and as long as we've most likely also well before that.
Yeah. It's interesting because like that's definitely true. Like the world didn't like start in the 90s, right?
Yeah.
So it's funny that I was speaking to somebody recently and I was describing a song from like 2001. They're like, "Oh, old school." And I'm like, take that back right now. But I also mean just like the idea that sections of scientific knowledge could also just get totally lost. Like what happened to this entire medical history before it was rediscovered before these objects were rediscovered in the 20th century?
Yeah. I think there are threads of it throughout history. So, for example, after 500 BCE in ancient Mesopotamia, after the zodiac gets developed, which is its own thing that I can talk about for hours, a way of just organizing the sky in a way that makes it easier to track observations. But the development of the zodiac also leads to a host of medical ways of understanding the body in relation to different segments of the sky. And astrological medicine does survive in some medieval texts, and I do think it has its beginnings in ancient Mesopotamia and then sort of survives through transmission into Greek and then through there into various other text cultures. And you can really trace that in astronomy. So a lot of the, again, things like the zodiac, the 60-minute hour, or the organization of time into sexagesimal system, as well as some of the ways of understanding eclipse cycles, like the Saros cycle. Those all come from ancient Mesopotamia, from ancient Babylonia specifically, from about the middle of the first millennium BCE onward. And those threads do find their way into other tradition. But yeah, the rest is kind of buried in time until it gets unearthed by and studied and understood by someone and then made available, most importantly.
So I have to blame Mesopotamians for people ask me like what my star sign is?
Kinda, yeah.
So please walk me through that. I'm very, very curious. If only to give me defense against people or equip me with knowledge. When did astrology start?
So from very early periods, and arguably even 3000 from the earliest periods of writing, the people of Mesopotamia observed stuff going on in the sky. And from around 2000 BCE onwards, we start to get these textbooks of observations of stuff going on in the sky, as well as other observations generated from those, paired with predictions for things on Earth. So these we call omens, right? If there is an eclipse, then the king will die. Or if Venus appears to be shining, then on the right side of the moon, then somebody will have a difficult childbirth, that sort of thing. So these observations and predictions create a kind of culture of empirical observation amongst scholars in ancient Mesopotamia that develops over the course of many generations until those observations get used to predict other observations, astronomical observations, and to create mathematical models for those observations. And the zodiac is really an offshoot of that. There was a kind of segment of astronomy called schematic astronomy, where things were broken down into ideal schemas or categories that don't necessarily match up to reality. And one of those was the calendar. There were two calendars. There was the lunar calendar, which was literally like, when is there a new moon, like the way Ramadan is calculated today or decided on today. But there was also a schematic calendar that was just like, all right, we're just going to have like 12 months of 30 days each because it's too complicated to like assign loans and calculate interest if we're like trying to do this every single month. And those 12 months of 30 days eventually get kind of mapped onto the sky. And the 12 segments of the ecliptic, which is where eclipses occur, the band of the sky where eclipses occur, get divided into 12 sections of 30 degrees each. So it's really a spatial kind of, a spatial extension of understandings of time, which I think is so interesting. And that, once the zodiac is developed, it allows people to organize, like I said, other kinds of information, like about the human body, but also about people's births. So from around 500 BC, a little bit later than 500 BCE onward, you start to have horoscopes for babies born. So a baby is born on the night of April, whatever, and this is where Venus was, this is where the moon was, this is what eclipse took place in the last 6 months or is going to take place, and this is the prediction. This baby will have a hardship, but then things will get better, or this baby will have a great life, or it's broken, the text is broken, so we have no idea what it says. So you can blame the Babylonians. After developing the zodiac, that's just one of the things they decided to use it for, and people just rolled with it.
Was it like, is there evidence that it was a popular thing? Like it was part of people's daily life? People knew what was... it was actually an organizing principle for life.
I don't know. I mean, that's one of the problems with cuneiform is that even though there are hundreds of thousands of texts that tell us about so many different things, from the kids in Amar to what Hammurabi has written down as laws or his scribes, there are lots of things that are missing. Right? It only preserves the things that people could afford to or really needed to wrote down. Yeah. So it doesn't necessarily tell us what every person might have understood when it comes to the zodiac, but there are enough horoscopes for birth horoscopes to suggest that this was a somewhat popular practice. Whether it was written down or whether someone could afford to get it written down or to gain enough literacy to write it down themselves is another question, but it must have been some part of the culture. Okay.
When you say there are enough horoscopes, like what would a horoscope actually include 3,000 years ago?
Yeah, they were quite specific the way that they were written. They include specific kinds of information, which was the kinds of information people observed in the sky anyway. So where were all the visible planets at the time of the birth or within a few weeks or months of the birth? And what eclipses were predicted and didn't get observed? So sometimes an eclipse is predicted, but it doesn't get observed because it's like maybe a little further south or north, or there are clouds on the night that it's supposed to be observed, which is like something that still plagues astronomers today. As I understand it, is just the weather. It makes things a bit harder to see. So there were really specific kinds of information, and based on that, a prediction is generated. We don't know the relationship between those observations and why is it going to be good for this person, but because Venus is in a different constellation for this other kid, maybe things are not going to go so great. It's not super clear, the connection between the two, but there is some, to some degree, somebody back then saw the connection.
Yeah. And how did astrology move into astronomy?
So it was a bit of both at all times. There's an excellent there's a seriologist at I think he's in a university in Canada, in British Columbia, called M. Willis Monroe. He's utterly brilliant, and he calls it astronomology. It's like a mix of astrology and astronomy because they were never fully separated in most periods of Mesopotamian history. People observed the skies and they made these really detailed astronomical observations and predictions in order to carry out predictions of stuff that's going to happen on Earth. And this was a tool used by kings. So if you think of King Ashurbanipal, who ruled over what was the world's largest empire at the time, he had this library at his disposal, which is to some degree a modern construct, but it did include a lot of text filled with these omens. And he had a retinue of scholars whose sole job it was to observe the skies at night and report back to him, listen, this star was not visible, or this planet was visible in this constellation. Don't go into battle today. It's not a good idea. Or today is a great day to launch your campaign against whatever civilization. So go for it. So they were trusted to that degree. They were kind of taken that seriously, and it was done that systematically. It was relied on.
Okay, I want to talk a little bit about some of the women that you've featured, not only in your book but also in your studies. You mentioned one already, but do you mind taking us through a few of these stories that and why also you made maybe you didn't even make a point, but your approach to writing about them?
Yeah, so I think I'd love to start with Enheduanna. She is, as far as we know, the first named author in history, which is so cool that it's a woman. Yeah. And
Say her name again?
Enheduanna.
So for people listening to this, can you spell it out just for a second?
Yeah, sure. So it's Enheduanna. Enheduanna. And there's a wonderful book with a translation of her hymns and her work, as well as some background on her by Sophus Hele, if anyone's interested. I think it's just called Enheduanna. And she lived around 2300 BC. She was also the daughter of a king, King Sargon, possibly the founder of the world's first empire, and the kind of first Akkadian speakers that appear in the written record come from that era as well. And she was, because his empire expanded so broadly, she was sort of installed in Ur, again, southern Iraq, to help consolidate his power in the area. So she wasn't just a figurehead. As a priestess to the moon god, she had various cultic and religious roles, but also administrative roles that meant she controlled quite a lot of land in the area on behalf of the king and the temple. So she, I think, is a really interesting figure that can tell us that women were, the sources from ancient Mesopotamia are far from silent on women. I mean, so much so that the first named author is actually a woman. The works by her come from their copies from later periods, so it's slightly complicated. It's not as straightforward as their copies from 2300 BCE, but it's still, she's the first one who gets named, which I think is really interesting. So I love that we get to start with her. But there are also some,
what's funny? Sorry, before you keep on going. Yeah. It's funny because I'm listening to you say that, and my impression of her as you spoke changed over time. Yeah. Because you're like, she was the first author in history. And I'm like, oh my God, sounds like an incredible person. I can't wait to hang out with her. And you're like, she was the son of a king, probably the first emperor ever. And I'm like, okay, all right, okay. He invented empire. And I'm like,
great.
Okay, great. And you're like, oh no, don't get me wrong. She wasn't just an intellectual hang out at home. No. She ruled over people. No, this wasn't just an administrative thing. She did some active ruling. It's like, okay, all right, maybe I don't like her so much. Yeah, maybe not.
Yeah, but I mean, I think the interesting thing about her, though, is that it tells us that women weren't just kind of these silent, background noise or silent background noise, whatever. You know what I'm trying to say?
The
sentence made no sense, but I totally hear you. Not every first is a good first.
Yeah,
I would say.
As it turns out, women are humans. There are nice ones and not nice ones. They are like everybody else.
Exactly.
Okay.
But yeah, I mean, I think there are also, if we go forward in history a couple hundred years, there was a vast trade network in between sort of 1900 and 1600 BCE, or 2000 and 1600 BCE. And today we call this the Old Assyrian period, to kind of situate it in the kind of broader history of ancient Assyria. And during this period, women in the heartland of Assyria would weave these incredible textiles, and they would send them north, a 5-week donkey ride, essentially north, to family members or business partners in what is now Turkey. I mentioned one earlier called Lamasi. And what I love about this era is that we have thousands of over 20,000 documents that tell us about this kind of trade network and people's everyday lives. And many of the letters are from women to their brothers or their husbands or whoever else in Anatolia, telling them about life back home. And I think that that's another interesting kind of window onto the lives of women, working women, women who were part of this kind of trade network, and not just part of the trade network in the sense that they were making it possible for other people to do. They were making the actual products that were getting traded. So I think that's another interesting window onto the lives of women. And in the same era, if we go further south in Babylonia, there were these groups of women living together called the Naditu, and they were in the city of Sippar in particular. They were kind of the wives of the moon god, but essentially they lived together in cloisters, and they adopted daughters, and they tried to pass their wealth on to daughters, and they served as their own scribes, and they purchased land and rented it out. So they also had this sort of business network. So it's another interesting window that's a different way of having a family in the ancient world that still gives us a window onto the activities of women. So I think there's so much to say. We could do a whole episode on just the women. And then of course there are, the queens and those that are kind of going back to Enheduanna, the buildup of information about her, making her less and less likable. That that we can learn a lot from. I mean, one of my favorite sort of facts is that in ancient Mesopotamia, the scorpion is a symbol of motherhood, which is really taken on board, let's say, by the Assyrian queens of the first millennium BCE. And the reason for that is that they were thought to fiercely defend their young. I don't know if you've ever seen a picture of a scorpion with babies, but they carry their babies on their back for I don't know how many days or weeks. I don't know how long scorpions live for, but so that they can easily protect them with their poisonous tail. And I think that the idea that there's this kind of instead of the scorpion being this negative thing, it was seen as this creature that really loved and wanted to protect fiercely its children.
Amazing.
Yeah.
All right. Before we wrap up, I want to wrap up with one last thing. Oh, we also didn't get to the princess.
Oh, yeah.
The queen. Let's talk about the princess or the queen.
Princess Enigaldinana. Yeah.
Yeah. Tell us about her a little more. I know you mentioned her earlier, and then I want to end with one final question.
Yeah, so we don't know much about her, actually. So we know surprisingly little. So she had the same role that Enheduanna had, but almost 2,000 years later in the 500s BCE. We don't even know her real name. We just know that the name she was given when she was consecrated as the high priestess to the moon god in Ur was Enigaldinana, just like Enheduanna was also given that name. We know that there are a couple of economic documents that suggest something about her. And I think really what we can say about her, we have to use the lives of other women to reconstruct it. Other priestesses in the same role as her, but also other working women, like some of the ones that I talked about. So we know very little about her. We know that her palace contained these older objects, so maybe she ran some sort of a collection or museum. But other than that, unless something has very recently been published or new texts have been unearthed, maybe one day we'll know more about her. But as of now, very little. Okay.
The last question I want to ask is, this is a kind of a joke question, but who are the top 5 Mesopotamians, dead or alive? This is obviously pulling from sort of the hip hop world, top 5 rappers dead or alive, or top 5 players that are dead or alive. There have been some major figures. Who are the top 5 Mesopotamians, dead or alive?
I think it would be really kind of wrong of me not to stick Gilgamesh on there because, yeah, his story it covers so many universal worries and truths, and it's, it's a love story. It's a story about grief. It's a story about anxiety, about death, about life, and it's about, mortality, and it's just an incredible story.
For people who don't know, who's Gilgamesh?
So Gilgamesh was a legendary king. He may have also been a real king, but we only know about him from literary texts and some sort of legendary contexts. And he is a tyrant who meets his match in his friend, companion, and probably lover, Enkidu. There's a lot of language that suggests that their relationship was like a husband and wife. So he loved him like a bride, for example, is some of the language used. And when he dies, Gilgamesh veils his face like a bride. So he and Enkidu go on all these adventures, and then after one of them, Enkidu dies, and Gilgamesh is just bereft. I mean, he just like cannot function. He's grieving so badly he won't even let them take the body away.
Suffering from a broken heart.
An utterly broken heart, exactly. And finally, he kind of decides to go on this quest for immortality because he's so anxious about death after this happens. One of the many ways people deal with grief, maybe, is to be anxious about their own mortality as well. And he goes on a quest to find the oldest man alive, who is Utanapishti, the Noah figure in this story. So we talked about Atrahasis earlier in the podcast. In the later traditions, his name is Utanapishti. And he goes beyond the limits of the known world, past where the sun rises and sets. He arrives to the kind of gates of the twin mountains where the sun rises and sets, which is guarded by these half scorpions, half humans who say you can't pass. And then they kind of take one more look and they're like, actually, you look terrible. We're just going to let you through. You don't look like you can, it's up to you if you wanted to go through here. Onto this kind of legendary world beyond the limits of the known world. And he finds Utanapishtim and he asks him what's the key to immortality. And the guy says, well, it's definitely not looking for immortality because that doesn't exist. And you're wasting your time. You're wasting your life looking for this and wandering around and being so disheveled and bereft. So go back to your city, stop being an a-hole, and rule like a proper king. And when your community survives, that is your survival. So I think really top 5 dead or alive is Gilgamesh, because in many ways he's still alive, because we are still alive. So I think that's, number 1. Really, I shouldn't have started with him. Really, I should have ended with him. But
No, that's okay. Who else makes the cut?
I hope, people like the twins and the toddler and the baby from Amar will make the cut. I hope that they will be remembered and the kind of tragedies that was visited on everyday people can be remembered through them, just in general, because I think we all go through horrible things in our lives, and for many people it's much worse than for others. And I think that's a reminder of that. We need to be empathetic and bear witness to other people's suffering. I think Enheduanna, despite her being an arm of empire, just deserves some top 5 dead or alive love because she was an author, and because her work is actually very beautiful and elevates, certain members of the pantheon in a way that other work has never done before. So there is something really unique about her and her work. And no pressure. I get one more. There is a little boy called Su'ayya in the Old Assyrian period, so 200 to 1600 BCE. And his dad is in Anatolia in this kind of trade network, far from home. And he's in Ashur with his family. And he writes a letter to his dad saying, I'm learning Cuneiform. And this text is in like impeccable handwriting compared to the 20,000 other texts that are just really hard to read. And it's just such a lovely moment between a kid and his dad. I don't know how the dad would have reacted, but it's just a reminder that the stuff we care about like hasn't really changed. Like they loved their babies dearly. They worried about getting market rate for their goods. They got annoyed at each other. The kids wanted to impress their parents. They experienced anxiety and heartbreak and everything else that we experience. So I think I really love that tablet. It's such a sweet tablet.
So funny. I mean, like I've been joking a lot, but I feel like so much of this book is about parenting for you?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I wrote it at is there ever a good time to write a book? Probably not, because it's really hard to write a book. But I wrote it when I was pregnant after a lot of miscarriages. And I had a toddler whose pregnancy was also after a lot of miscarriages. So it was a mix for me. It was a mix of sort of anxiety and empathy and love. And really, I didn't look at the text academically the way I had been, as one has to really when it's your job to look at them academically and teach them and worry about the grammar and worry about the historical context. I looked at them as someone who'd gone through a lot of painful stuff, and that a lot of people go through, and with a new kind of empathy that I think I was so grateful to have when seeing life through the eyes of someone who's never seen a lot of things before, like a small toddler. So I think that really shaped how I approached the subject. And I was really grateful to get the chance to write it at that time in my life, even though I was extremely sleep deprived and sad and lots of other things. But it shaped the book a lot. So I think in many ways the book is about parenthood, but it's also about really being human and what it is that we share with each other, what we share with our kids, with someone that we've never met before, who we think is totally different to us, but isn't actually as other as we might think. So.
Did you change? Did you sort of change throughout the process? Obviously, writing a book is an arduous process, but did you feel like that you changed a little bit in learning these very human stories?
I think in a way, yes. I think I changed in relation to the subject, because I love doing outreach. I love making this stuff available to people and writing about it in a way that isn't going to put people to sleep, which is like, the way I write an academic article is like the most boring thing you've ever read. Like if you had to read my PhD, you'd be like, I'm not doing this. This is so boring, even though the subject itself is interesting. So I think I changed in the sense that it really redefined my relationship with history as a kind of source for humanity, as a source for connection, and not just as a subject of study. And I after finishing the book, I made the decision to leave academia. I'm lucky enough to be appointed an honorary fellow, so I can still have an affiliation. But I made the choice to stick with just outreach and writing about it for as many people as are interested, but don't have time to get into the nitty-gritty of it and just want the cool stuff, the stuff that's really relatable and beautiful and memorable. So I think in that sense I changed for sure.
Yeah. Okay, before I let you go, can you give us a few recommendations of other books to read or things to look into, resources online or films to watch related to this topic?
Yeah, there's actually one right here, which is right there because I'm always referring to it. But it's a book by Eckhart Fromm, who's a professor in the subject, called Assyria: Rise and Fall of the World's First Empire. It's a really excellent book, and it's full of individual stories. It's not just a broad, history of an empire. There's another great book called Weavers, Scribes. Oh my gosh, what is it called? It's by Amanda Padani. It has a great title that I'm forgetting right now for some reason. And it's another really great resource for those who are interested in the people and the people individual lives. Those are two great books. There are two really great A Short Introduction books, A Short Introduction to Assyria and A Short Introduction to the Ancient Near East. And there's a lovely documentary for those who can read French or understand French. I'm sure there's a version with subtitles on Taram Kubi, who is one of the old Assyrian women who weaved textiles. It's probably available to watch for free online. And there's a great podcast called Thin Edge of the Wedge, which is by a curator called John Taylor, who interviews other academics in the field to allow people a platform to share their research in an accessible way. I think those are my kind of top 4 or 5 things that I would recommend.
Okay, amazing. We will include these all in the captions. Where can people find you, or where should people find you before I let you go?
I'm on Blue Sky a lot. I do lots of threads. I share lots of information and tablets, whatever I come across or whatever I think people might enjoy learning about ancient Mesopotamia. And I'm also on Instagram, although I don't do very much there. I would say Blue Sky is the best place to go
Cool.
to geek out with me.
Amazing. Moudhy, thanks so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you.